single day, the devastating power of atomic energy was unveiled and the race for nuclear supremacy began. Now, over 6 decades later, the threat of nuclear weapons still shapes foreign policy. While Cold War rivalry has faded, America faces a different kind of arms race. Russia is openly helping dangerous rogue nations, enemies of the United States, achieve nuclear weapons capability. But at the very time the U.S. should be standing up to Russia's dangerous alliances, our government is rewarding Russia with our own valuable nuclear technology. The good news is that we can change this dangerous situation today through common sense reform. The United States federal government must significantly reform its policy toward Russia by withholding our nuclear technology until Russia reforms. We'll examine the threat, the failure of current policy, and the solution that we propose. The threat. Russia gives nuclear assistance to rogue states. Russia gives nuclear assistance to rogue states. Subpoint 1, Iran. As a sponsor of terrorism and an aggressive enemy of the United States, Iran's nuclear program is a serious threat to America's security. In April 2010, Fox News announced, quote, with sufficient foreign assistance, Iran could probably develop and test an intercontinental ballistic missile capable of reaching the United States by 2015, says a new report by the Department of Defense, unquote. With enough foreign support, Iran could probably hit the United States with a missile in just 4 short years. In June 2008, non-proliferation expert Henry Sokolsky pinpointed a key source of Iran's foreign assistance. Quote, perhaps no country has contributed so much to Iran's nuclear program as Russia, unquote. Dr. Eyal Cohen, PhD in law and diplomacy, said in September 2010, quote, Russia constructed and fueled Iran's nuclear reactor in Bushehr last month and guaranteed a 10-year supply of the uranium needed to fuel the reactor, unquote. Russia is determined to increase ties with Iran despite international sanctions. Iranian international news network Press TV reported in July 2010, quote, the Russian energy minister says sanctions will have no bearing on Tehran-Moscow cooperation, including mutual work on the nuclear front. The top Russian official underlined the two countries are intent on boosting cooperation, unquote. While Russia seeks to deepen its dangerous alliance with Iran, 2 other nuclear threats loom on the horizon. Subpoint 2, Syria. According to United Press International in May 2010, quote, Russian President Medvedev says Russia could build nuclear power reactors in Syria, unquote. Independent journalist Dmitry Sidorov warned in June 2010, quote, even the possibility of Russia's nuclear assistance to Syria should scare the White House. The U.S. ended up paying a hefty price for failing to take effective measures to prevent Russia from nuclear cooperation with Iran. The very same scenario could take place in Syria if the nuclear cooperation project between Russia and Syria is not stopped, unquote. It is crucial for the U.S. to sever Russia's cooperation with Syria before the situation spins out of control. However, Russia's nuclear aid does not end here. Subpoint 3, Venezuela. According to Radio Free Europe in October 2010, quote, Russia and Venezuela signed an agreement for Russia to build Venezuela's first nuclear power plant, unquote. International Affairs Review took a look at the Venezuelan program on December 13, 2010. Quote, the Venezuelan civilian program is a necessary precondition for a weapons program and makes such a program possible. Venezuela's close ties with Syria and Iran should cause observers to doubt just how seriously it will take its non-proliferation requirements, unquote. Russia's assistance opens the door for Venezuela to pursue weapons that could endanger U.S. security. But at the very time that the United States should be standing up to Russia, our government is rewarding its dangerous policies. This brings us to the next point, current policy, the 1-2-3 agreement with Russia. The 1-2-3 agreement with Russia. Despite Russia's persistent support of our enemies, the U.S. is handing over valuable nuclear technology to Russia through the 1-2-3 agreement. Energy policy expert Robert Alvarez explained the agreement in June 2008. Well, the 1-2-3 agreement would establish a 30-year framework for nuclear commerce between the former Cold War enemies, allowing the transfer of nuclear commodities, such as reactor components and U.S. government-owned technologies and materials to Russia, unquote. In other words, 1-2-3 cooperation allows the exchange of nuclear technology between Russia and the United States. This agreement directly threatens our security in 2 ways. First, Russia can misuse U.S. technology. The 1-2-3 agreement gives Russia U.S. technology it could share with our enemies. Matthew Furman, PhD in political science, articulated the risks of civilian nuclear cooperation in June 2009. quote, all types of civilian nuclear assistance raise the risks of proliferation. Civilian cooperation provides technology and materials necessary for a nuclear weapons program and helps to establish expertise in matters relevant to building the bomb, unquote. Civilian cooperation provides technology that is dual use. Russia could use this energy to generate energy or to aid dangerous nuclear weapons programs. Unfortunately, the damage continues. This brings us to the second consequence: Russian policy rewarded. Through the 123 agreement, the United States is putting its stamp of approval on Russia's dangerous policies. In June 2008, Representative Alina Ros-Lehtinen had explained how the 123 agreement will be interpreted. Quote, the 123 agreement will inevitably be seen as a political reward by the United States, despite Russia's continued assistance to Iran, unquote. In other words, the United States is shooting itself in the foot by rewarding Russia for putting our own citizens at risk. Current policy fails to protect the United States, and so to better protect America, we propose the following three-step plan. Step 1, suspend the 123 agreement. The U.S. will suspend cooperation with Russia under the 123 agreement, except for non-proliferation efforts, until Russia has stopped nuclear assistance to Iran, Syria, and Venezuela. Step 2, reward cooperation. Once U.S. intelligence agencies confirm that Russia has completely cut off assistance, the U.S. will reactivate the 123 agreement. Step 3, ongoing enforcement. If Russia resumes nuclear assistance in the future, the 123 agreement will be suspended for 10 years. This common sense reform brings about two significant advantages. Advantage 1 is U.S. technology protected. Our plan withholds U.S. technology until Russia ceases nuclear assistance to rogue states. If Russia reforms, then 123 cooperation will be reactivated. If Russia refuses to change, U.S. technology will be withheld. But either way, America will be protected. Advantage 2 is incentive for Russia to change. Current policy blindly rewards Russia despite its dangerous alliances. Our plan leverages the benefits of the 123 agreement to give Russia an incentive to reform. Aaron Beatman, Masters in International Affairs, wrote in February 2010, quote, the 123 agreement would legalize transfers of U.S. origin spent nuclear fuel to Russia. This could provide Russia with nearly $20 billion in storage fees, unquote. Our policy change uses a $20 billion incentive to convince Russia to isolate Iran, Syria, and Venezuela, making it that much harder for these nations to reach their dangerous goal. Today, our government's policy fails to protect American technology, but ultimately the American people. We ask you to change that policy and give Russia an incentive to change as well. Thank you. I'm now open to any questions from the negative team.
Versus height. That's essentially what we believe this debate round is going to come down to, because we see that there is obviously a lot of concern about Iran getting nuclear weapons, Venezuela and Syria pursuing nuclear programs, etc. But as policymakers, we really need to put the news headlines about all the hype that Russia is doing this, the United States is helping Iran, etc. Put those aside for a second and really objectively analyze what's actually happening in the real world. Because foreign policy is not as simple as, we have this agreement with Russia, if we cut it, Iran will not go nuclear. It's unfortunately not that simple. We need to really take a real world approach, look at the facts in today's debate round. We believe that when you do that, at the end of today's debate round, you will come to the conclusion that the 123 agreement, it wasn't meant as a reward or a potential sanctioning measure for Russia. It was instead two countries agreeing, hey, we both have technology, we could be sharing this, we could be helping each other's economies, let's do that. It is not a reward, it is not dangerous, and the Affirmative Team's plan is not going to help America's security. That's essentially our beliefs in a nutshell. Now first I'm going to be going down a couple points that I believe the Affirmative Team needs to prove in order to win today's debate round. And these aren't just questions that we're posing to them, these are actually standards we're going to be carrying through today's entire debate round as to what they need to show to really win. Essentially what you would have to believe to vote affirmative. First thing they have to prove is that the U.S. citizen security is actually going to benefit from suspending 123. Let's take this to the impact level in the real world. How are we going to be better as our security as United States citizens, the United States of America, if we suspend 123? Because it's nice that we can stand up to Russia, but unless that's actually going to stop proliferation, unless that's actually going to prevent countries from going nuclear, it doesn't really mean a thing in the real world. Second thing they have to prove is that the 123 program is actually assisting nuclear weapons programs, or that it's giving Russia something they don't already have. As my partner pursued in cross-examination, this is essentially a mutually beneficial trade deal. Russia gets some upgraded tech, we get some money. vice versa. It's mutually beneficial trade deal, but it's not giving them anything that they don't really already have. There's not a significant threat here. Third, they need to prove that Russia would forego trade relations with 3 countries for the United States. They talked under their advantage too about how it's $20 billion incentive, but they are talking about Russia giving up basically all of their arms sales deals with 3 countries. That is, there's significantly more money in having trade relations with those countries than there is in a small deal with the United States. They need to prove their plan has solvency. Lastly though, fourth, that they need to prove that the 1-2-3 agreement is that without it, countries will lack the technology to go nuclear. They essentially need to prove that the 1-2-3 agreement is providing something useful. Because in actuality, it's just sharing civilian nuclear material that is helpful to countries, sure, but is not any key element in anybody's nuclear program. With that in mind, let's go down to the line-by-line argumentation of the 1AC. They talked about the threat. That was really the bulk of their case here, that there's nuclear assistance to rogue states. So point A was Iran. I have 3 responses to the Iran point. My first response, you could just fold this as completely non-unique, because the fact remains that affirmative or negative box at the end of today's debate round, Iran is going to go nuclear. They essentially have. Everybody could stop helping Iran right now, and they would still go nuclear in just a few weeks. This is from the Daily Mail Reporter on June 7th of 2011. It says, quote, Iran is only a matter of months from being able to create a nuclear weapon, according to experts. And quote, they have all the material, they have all the capabilities, they have been getting the ability to enrich uranium over time, and they are essentially only a few months away. It is quite frankly too late to do anything about Iran, and a small sanction on Russia is just going to isolate an important country. It's not going to do anything for U.S. security. Second response is dealing specifically with what Russia did. Because we see the affirmative team has the burden of proof, and they've really failed to show any one key incident where Russia did something that helped Iran. The only one incident they were able to identify was that of the Bushehr reactor. Now this is very interesting because this is something that Washington is entirely okay with. In fact, most of the international world is completely fine with Iran having this. Most of the world agrees that Iran can pursue civilian nuclear energy. That's the official UN stance on the matter. It's not a problem. This is from Radio Free Europe, August 22nd of 2010. It says, quote, Washington says it sees no proliferation risk from the launch of Iran's first nuclear power plant. The U.S. State Department said that Moscow's agreement to supply nuclear fuel and remove spent fuel rods minimized the risk that they would be used to make nuclear weapons, end quote. This is again a key difference between civilian nuclear energy and energy for military purposes or for nuclear weapons purposes. The affirmative team is again, they're relapsing into the hype, the media hype that does happen anytime you're providing civilian nuclear energy. People say, oh, but they could build a nuclear weapon. It's entirely different. The uranium is enriched to entirely different levels. The technology is different. The information is different. The scientists who do this are different. It's completely different issues. Third and final response to the Iran point is to turn this point on them, actually, because what are they doing? It's too late to prevent Iran from going nuclear, so you have to look at, since Iran is going nuclear, what is the best policy to approve? And that is to not isolate a key country like Russia. The turn is that suspending the 1-2-3 agreement could actually push Russia towards Iran by isolating a key potential ally. This is from Andrew J. Grotto. He is a JD in September 2007. He says, quote, Russia's increasingly assertive and at times belligerent behavior in the past several years ought to dispel any hope that holding up a nuclear cooperation agreement will coerce a fundamental change in its Iran policy. Rather, an attempt by the United States to economically coerce it would strengthen the hands of hardliners in Moscow who reject Russian cooperation with the United States and see Iran as an important tactical ally in the Middle East, end quote. Now I realize this piece of evidence doesn't specifically say the 1-2-3 agreement, but it is talking about any sort of economic leverage on Russia. We look to advantage to $20 billion. This is clearly economic leverage towards Russia that we're trying to use. It's too late. Quite frankly, we have to accept that, move on, say what's the next best thing we can do. That's to try to embrace Russia and cooperate with them so that we can react to future threats. But let's move on though to subpoints B and C, talking about Syria and Venezuela. I really have 3 responses to this argument. First of all, ultimately they failed to uphold their burden of proof with these 2 points. It's all hypothetical. With Syria, their piece of evidence said they could build a nuclear reactor in Syria. So they could build a civilian nuclear reactor in Syria. Those are 2 big steps away from anything remotely related to a weapons program. Second response is Venezuela. As was admitted in cross-examination, they've essentially froze their nuclear program due to fears over what happened in Japan. They're not moving forward on that right now, and again, there's no proof that Russia's given them anything. That is super helpful. Third response, though, is that even if Russia's helping these two countries in a way that's harmful to our security, 123 is completely separate from this because the 123 agreement does not allow the transfer of any sensitive or restricted data and technology. This is from John Rode, hearing before the House Committee on Foreign Affairs, June 2008. Quote, the 123 agreement does not permit transfers of any restricted data and permits transfers under the agreement of sensitive nuclear technology only by amendment of the agreement, end quote. In other words, the people who designed this policy, they were not idiots, quite frankly. They realized that you need to have some stipulations. You're not just going to give away all your nuclear technology, all your special knowledge to a country like Russia where we do have some security concerns. We have a tense relationship. So we take a step back, we say we need to look at Russia. We have concerns with them for sure, but they're an important country in this world. We cannot isolate our relationship with them because Iran is going nuclear. It's too late to do anything about that. So let's take a step back, let's recap. Russia is not going to try to gain $20 billion of the United States money just to isolate 3 key trading partners. It's not going to turn towards us, it's going to turn away from us, and our security will be worse for it. Thank you, I'm now open for questions.
In today's debate, we're going to agree that the highest priority of our government, and the highest priority of any government ever instituted by man, I would claim, is the security of its citizens. Now the question for us in today's debate round is our current policy adequate to secure American security? And the answer, I would contend, is no, because our current policy is not only ignoring the dangerous threat posed by Russia's assistance to rogue states, our current policy is actually exacerbating that threat by throwing our own technology into the mix and rewarding Russia for its actions. So what I'll be doing in this speech is reestablishing the fact that our security is threatened and that the solution to that threat is to reform our policy, and then also addressing the negative team's various points that they raised in their first speech. Let's begin with the negative team's 4 questions that they laid out for you at the beginning of their first speech in this debate round. The first question was, does our plan in fact improve security through setting new conditions for Russia to reach the 123 agreement? And this is really the entire tenor of this speech and of the round, so I'll be demonstrating that we do in fact improve security throughout my entire speech today. The second question was, is the 123 agreement helping Russia? And to answer this question, I'd like to cite the National Iranian-American Council on March 3, 2009, when they say, quote, Moscow badly wants last year's 123 agreement to pass through Congress so it can receive highly valuable technical assistance from American nuclear scientists. So we see that, as a matter of fact, Russia does badly want the 123 agreement because of the value that it holds to the Russian economy and to the Russian nuclear sector. And that value, as we quantified for you in our first affirmative constructive, is $20 billion. Now we will be weighing that $20 billion versus what Russia is currently getting from Iran, and showing you that with our plan, when we force Russia to choose, they can't have their cake and eat it too. The choice they'll make is actually to cooperate with the US under our plan. The third question from the negative team was whether or not Russia will forego its cooperation. Now, in order to analyze this question and determine whether or not Russia will abandon its cooperation with Iran, Syria, and Venezuela in order to work with the US through the 123 agreement, we have to simply look at incentives. Foreign policy is based around incentives, and that means numbers. So we have to begin by examining the Bushehr reactor. From the Nuclear Threat Initiative in 2009, quote, in August 1995, Russia entered into a 10-year contract to supply nuclear fuel for the Bushehr plant. And then Project, which is an arms control information website, actually the Times, a British newspaper, says in 2009, quote, Russia has supplied nuclear technology to Iran, including the $1 billion Bushehr reactor. So the conclusion is Russia's cooperation with Iran amounts to $1 billion over a 10-year time span. Now, in contrast, we demonstrated that Russia stands to gain $20 billion from the 123 agreement. In other words, when our plan forces them to choose between cooperation with Iran and cooperation with the US, the incentive is $20 billion over 10 years versus $1 billion over 10 years, and the incentives align for Russia under our plan to cooperate with the US. Now, the final question from the negative team was whether or not the 123 agreement actually helps Russia's nuclear sector. And as my partner pointed out, civilian cooperation, such as the 123 agreement, involves dual-use technology, which can be used for either production of nuclear energy or production of nuclear weapons. I'll be addressing how the 123 agreement aids weapons programs in just a minute in my speech. But the important point is the 123 agreement is dual-use. So with that in mind, let's move on to the negative team's next arguments. They addressed our claims about Iran in the following way. They first said Iran is months away from acquiring nuclear capability, and so that means that we shouldn't take action on Iran. Now my first point is to simply point out the fallacy in this logic. If Iran is months away from acquiring nuclear weapons, that indicates the urgency of the need for our plan. If Iran is months away, that indicates the necessity of our plan and just how serious the situation has become. Secondly, my second response is to point you back to the evidence in our first affirmative constructive stating that the reason Iran is so close is that no country has benefited its weapons program as much as Russia. And as we cited, the Department of Defense is saying, by 2015, if Iran continues to receive valuable foreign assistance from nations, primarily Russia, then it will be able to hit the US with an ICBM. So the key is cutting off that foreign assistance before 2015. That's how we stop Iran's nuclear program, and that's what our plan will do. The negative team's next claim is that there's no risk from the Bushehr reactor, that because it's simply a nuclear power plant, it doesn't pose a threat. And this is incorrect, because the fuel being supplied to the Bushehr reactor can be used by Iran to produce nuclear weapons. From Professor Henry Sokolsky, who's the director of nonproliferation at the Policy Education Center and a nonproliferation expert and an adjunct professor in 2008, quote, "The uranium fuel that the Russians must deliver to Bushehr could be seized to make a bomb's worth of weapon uranium, not in roughly a year, as would be the case with natural uranium, but in as little as 8 weeks. Similarly, Iran could seize the spent fuel and gain access to 30 crude bombs worth of near weapons-grade plutonium to make plutonium weapons." So what we see clearly from this piece of evidence is Iran and Russia's cooperation on the region's first nuclear reactor, the Bushehr power plant, poses a grave threat to U.S. security. It's something we have to cut off through providing Russia with a reason to cooperate us through incentives. And the negative team's only other response to this point about Iran was that if we suspend the 123 agreement, we might potentially push Russia away. Now we have to examine the evidence, because as the negative team kindly pointed out, it wasn't specific to the 123 agreement. It was in fact a general piece of evidence talking about economic leverage. And while economic leverage in general may not work on Russia, the 123 agreement specifically will work in order to induce cooperation. From Jack Spencer, who's a nuclear energy expert at the Heritage Foundation in 2008, quote, "Congress must assure that the 123 agreement includes provisions that compel Russia to discontinue support of Iran's military nuclear energy program. The problem with the current path is that the US has very little leverage to compel either Russia or Iran to do anything differently. The US should use the prospect of the 123 agreement as an incentive to halt Russia's interaction with Iran on nuclear issues." Mr. Spencer makes two important points. Number one, under the current policy advocated by the negative team, we have no leverage over Russia. And this lack of leverage over Russia is the reason that we can't compel them to do anything differently regarding Iran or these other rogue states. Number two, the way we get that leverage is by withholding the 123 agreement and setting new conditions until Russia cooperates with the US. The negative team then turned to Syria and Venezuela, and they had three responses. The first was a claim that these are hypothetical arguments, and this is simply based on a misunderstanding. The arguments about Syria and Venezuela are not hypothetical, they are actual fact. The fact is a risk exists from these weapons programs. As the negative team admitted in cross-examination, the existence of a threat to our security justifies reform. If we can prevent this problem before it blossoms into something on the scale of Iran, that's far better than waiting until we see a mushroom cloud and having to do cleanup. So preventative policy is the better option in this debate round. The next point that the negative team made was that the Venezuela program has been frozen, but this freeze is probably temporary. According to Venezuela Analysis in March 16, 2011, quote, "Yesterday, President Hugo Chavez put a freeze on Venezuela's nascent nuclear energy program as a result of the crisis underway in Japan." And then, quoting Chavez, it says, quote, "For the time being, I have ordered the Vice President and Minister of Energy, Rafael Ramirez, to put a freeze on the plans we have been advancing." So what we see is, while this freeze may be temporary, the contract with Russia is still on the books, and the risk posed by that program, the risk of a nuclear Venezuela in our backyard, independently, regardless of Iran and Syria, justifies reform. The final argument from the negative team in that first speech was a claim that the 123 agreement does not include sensitive data. Now, if we closely examine that piece of evidence, what it actually says is, once you pass a 123 agreement, sensitive nuclear data can be transferred between the two nations. That's my first response. And my second response is to point to the fact that, based on precedent, the US-India 123 agreement, the 123 agreement does transfer dual-use nuclear technology. From the Council on Foreign Relations, updated November 5th, 2010, quote, "What kind of technology would India receive in return under a 123 agreement? India would be eligible to buy US dual-use nuclear technology, including materials and equipment that could be used to enrich uranium or reprocess plutonium, potentially creating the material for nuclear bombs." So just as we've seen that Russia's cooperation with Iran is putting it on track to nuclear weaponry, in the same way, the 123 agreement is only adding fuel to the fire through providing our own technology into this problem. So what I believe I've proven in this speech so far is that there is a grave threat to our security. We need to not ignore that threat, but address it through reform. And the way to improve our security is through withholding the 123 agreement. Thank you very much.
The ability for you to vote for the affirmative team and for the affirmative team to warrant your ballot is the ability to know that what they've identified as a problem will actually change post-fiat, will actually change after you vote for the affirmative plan. What they fundamentally cannot prove to you is that that will happen, and that's what I'm going to be focusing on in this speech. Because if you look at the outline of the affirmative team's case, it's actually quite interesting. They talk a lot about how Iran is bad, Syria is bad, and Venezuela is bad, and that Russia has relations with all three of those countries. What not one of their cards say is that the 1-2-3 agreement uniquely gives those countries anything they couldn't already get. And that's the fundamental premise of negative argumentation, is that if you vote for the affirmative plan, these three nations will still go rogue. Russia will still provide nuclear technology because they have not given you a single example of something that these nations would get from the 1-2-3 agreement, or that Russia would get and then pass on, that can't already happen. Let's start off with the first argument, and this is under the idea of solvency. The first argument under solvency is that of links, and basically this is what I just talked about. The A point is that not one 1AC card, and not even a card they read in the last speech, mentions the 1-2-3 agreement. All it talks about is Russia giving technology to these nations, regardless of whether the agreement is in place or not. The B point basically is that uniqueness is required for an affirmative ballot. They have to prove that something changes post-plan, otherwise you're voting for the status quo, which is a negative, not affirmative ballot. And then the B point, or the C point rather, is the impact. What this argument means is that the harms the affirmative identifies happens independent of your vote. Regardless of which team you vote for, Iran will still go nuclear in 2 months. Venezuela, when their freeze is lifted, if you believe their argumentation on that, will still develop a civilian nuclear plant, and Syria may get nuclear assistance from Russia, irrespective of whether this agreement is in place or not. Let's move to my next solvency argument. I'm labeling under solvency for organizational purposes, but it basically is a burden of proof. What this does is it coalesces all negative argumentation into what the affirmative has to prove to win, and more of an a priori issue. A point. The affirmative has to prove that 1-2-3 gives Russia technology it already doesn't have. Now, in the first cross-examination, I established the fact, and I agree with the affirmative team, that Russia's technology is rudimentary compared to US technology. But regardless of the degree of sophistication, a nuclear weapon is a nuclear weapon. Rogue terrorist actors are not going to have the facilities that we have in our national laboratories, but we are scared stiff of them getting nuclear weapons because a bomb is a bomb regardless of how well it's made. This is the A point under the burden of proof. The affirmative needs to give you some idea that denying the 1-2-3 agreement to Russia will deny Russia technology they don't already have. Here's the B point. They have to prove to you that Russia doesn't have technology it needs to give to rogue nations. Because if Russia already has all the ability to make a nuclear weapon, regardless of whether they get better technology from the United States or not, they can still give what they have to these nations, crippling the affirmative's ability to access any sort of solvency. The C point under this is that they need to prove to you rogue nations need something they don't already have to go nuclear. And this is specifically dealing with the idea of Iran, as Venezuela and Syria admittedly are hypothetical at this stage. They have to prove to you, in order to access any ability that Iran won't go nuclear, that Iran needs some key piece of technology, that they need some key enrichment ability or some key item that Russia can give them that Russia can only get from the United States, and that denial will prevent Iran from going nuclear. Otherwise, what the affirmative spent 6 minutes telling you in the 1AC is still going to happen. D point under the burden of proof is the impact. Absent proof of all three of the above points, the affirmative alienates Russia while solving nothing. And this goes to the term that my partner brought up under their Iran point, because basically what the affirmative plan does is it destroys Russia's trust in the Obama administration and in the US cooperation while achieving nothing. And for proof of this, we turn to Paul Sanders' writing in 2010. Particularly important in the political context is the fact that many Russians view the 1-2-3 agreement as direct compensation for President Medvedev's decree banning the sale of air defense missiles to Iran. As a result, failure to bring the 1-2-3 agreement into force could have a serious impact on Russia's willingness to trust the Obama administration. Here's the important part. It is unlikely that Russia would be willing to do anything further on Iran if Russian officials do not believe that the US held up its end of this exchange, unquote. If you pass the affirmative plan, you solve nothing while crippling any future ability to control Iran once they have nuclear weapons, or to maybe try to destroy that program at some point in the future, which the status quo leaves you the ability to. Finally, I guess this is the E point under a burden of proof. This is a voter a priori, independent of everything else. Unless they prove the A through C points to you, the negative team wins the round. Let's move now to the negative team's disadvantage, and this deals specifically with the text of the affirmative mandates. You can label this disadvantage basically rogue nations, and that's what we're talking a lot about in this round, it seems. The A point under this disadvantage is the affirmative second mandate, that the 1-2-3 agreement will be reinstated after Russia stops cooperation with the three nations identified in the 1AC. What's the B point? Basically what the affirmative leaves the door open, because if you believe their argumentation that Russia is so dedicated to cooperating with these other countries, but at the same time they want technology from the United States, if those two facts are both true, then it's completely viable that Russia will give those other nations all the technology they need, then stop helping them and get the agreement reinstated. So this is basically a catch-22 where either way you go on believing the team's argumentation, the negative ballot is justified. Now here's the C point, and this is an important clarification. They can't come up here in the next speech and just say, well, we won't reinstate, because they didn't provide any metrics for barring that in their 1AC, and they can't add to their plan text at this point in the round. So what we're left with is wording in the 1AC that says once Russia stops cooperating, we reinstate it without any verification to determine whether or not Russia has given anything additional to those countries in the meantime. What this does is it fundamentally, again, this is a theme we're seeing, it debilitates their ability to solve anything that they claimed in their first speech. And what it does is it proves that on a calculus level, it's far better to keep the world's largest country engaged and actually liking us to maybe in the future help direct Iran in a better direction with its nuclear weapons program, help bring it into the international community, instead of alienating Iran, Venezuela, Syria, and Russia, while doing fundamentally nothing to cripple their nuclear weapons program. What do we see from the negative team at this point in the round? Basically what the affirmative gives you is a lot of scary rhetoric, and actually rhetoric that is quite true. If Iran gets a nuclear weapon, if Syria or Venezuela get a nuclear weapon, that would be really, really bad. Nuclear weapons make for a bad day when deployed. But basically what we're looking at is the fact that the 1-2-3 agreement up to this point, unproven by the affirmative team, is any player in the equation. It has no effect on these programs. All that it does, if you vote for the affirmative team, the only effect that you will have with an affirmative ballot is to alienate a key partner in dealing with the very problems the affirmative identified. It's because we believe that the affirmative has failed their burden of proof as the affirmative team. They failed to give you a case that solves the problem that they've identified and that actually has devastating consequences. I ask you to stick with the negative team, keep Russia engaged, and maybe in the future we can actually solve the problems the affirmative has laid out for us.